The teeth of the folding saw bite deeply into the fibrous, rain-soaked flesh of the heavy cedar timber, emitting a rhythmic, wet, tearing sound that echoes out into the misty expanse of the ancient forest. I am standing 80 feet above the soft, moss-covered ground, balanced precariously on a massive, naturally flat crotch of a colossal Douglas fir. The rain falls in a relentless, hypnotic cadence, drumming against the billions of needles above me and cascading down through the canopy in thick, heavy drops that shatter against my faded dark green wool work shirt. The wool is heavy now, saturated with the icy moisture of the storm, but it holds my body heat tightly against my skin. I pull the saw back, feeling the rough friction of the steel against the tight grain of the wood, and then push it forward again. The blade flexes slightly. Wet sawdust, the color of crushed rust, clumps together into a thick paste and falls in slow, heavy globs onto the dark, water-slicked bark of the giant tree beneath my worn leather work boots. I breathe in through my nose, a slow, measured inhalation that fills my lungs with the intoxicating, sharp scent of freshly cut cedar sap, the deep, earthy musk of decaying leaves far below, and the metallic, ozone-rich tang of the pouring rain. My hands, bare and calloused from years of shaping timber, grip the rough plastic and rubber handle of the saw with a practiced, unbroken tension. The cold rain runs down my forearms, matting the dark hair, pooling around the rolled-up cuffs of my sleeves before dripping off my elbows into the void. I adjust my stance, shifting my weight on the thick canvas of my weathered brown work pants. The leather patches at my knees are slick with tree resin and rainwater, scraping softly against the rough, deeply fissured bark of the fir. Every movement up here must be deliberate. The sheer drop surrounding me is a constant, silent presence, a void of gray mist and towering wooden pillars extending down into the shadows. I lean into the cut, letting the weight of my shoulders do the work rather than forcing the blade with my arms. The saw hums a low, grinding note as it nears the bottom of the timber. I slow my rhythm. The sound changes, becoming sharper, thinner, as the remaining fibers begin to groan under the weight of the overhanging wood. I reach out with my left hand, my fingers wrapping around the wet, cold end of the timber to support it, preventing it from tearing the grain as it snaps. With one final, delicate draw of the saw, the heavy block of cedar falls away. I guide it down, placing it gently onto a nearby branch so it does not plummet to the forest floor. The freshly exposed end of the timber is a vibrant and raw red against the dull grays and greens of the storm, perfectly flat and smooth, gleaming with moisture. I wipe the blade of the folding saw against my thigh, leaving a streak of orange sawdust on the wet brown canvas, and click the blade shut with a sharp, satisfying snap. I slide the tool back into the heavy leather belt resting on my hips, the thick hide groaning softly under the movement. The structure I am building is an impossibility of gravity and will, a suspended basin clinging to the side of this ancient giant, entirely reliant on the structural integrity of the interlocking wood and the immense strength of the living tree. I move toward the main trunk, a vertical wall of deeply grooved wood that feels as solid as a mountain face. Here, I have already begun to hollow out a massive mortise, a deep rectangular cavern carved directly into the dead heartwood of a massive secondary trunk that split from the main stem centuries ago. I reach into my tool belt and draw my heavy steel framing chisel and my wooden mallet. The handle of the chisel is turned ash, worn perfectly smooth by the friction of my palms over countless hours of labor, yet the wetness makes it slightly slippery. I grip it tighter, feeling the solid, comforting heft of the forged steel. I place the razor-sharp beveled edge of the chisel against the back wall of the mortise. The rain washes over my hands, pooling in the hollow I am carving. I raise the wooden mallet. The head is made of dense, heavy lignum vitae, scarred and dented from thousands of impacts. I bring it down in a short, controlled arc. The sound of the dense wood striking the ash handle is a sharp, percussive tock that cuts through the continuous white noise of the rain. The steel drives forward, biting a quarter inch into the wet cedar. I strike again. Tock. And again. Tock. With each blow, the shockwave travels down the shaft of the chisel, through the bones of my hand, up my forearm and into my shoulder, a steady, physical rhythm that anchors me to the work. I lever the handle of the chisel downward, and a thick rectangular chip of wet wood pops free with a crisp, snapping sound. I scoop the debris out with my fingers, tossing the fragrant shards into the air. They tumble down, quickly swallowed by the fog. The rain intensifies, a sudden squall pushing through the canopy. The wind howls, a low, mournful roar that shakes the very foundations of the forest. The colossal tree beneath me groans, a deep, vibrating acoustic hum that I feel in the soles of my leather boots. The trunk sways gently, a slow, majestic arc that forces me to widen my stance and press my hip against the wet bark for stability. The rain is blinding now, stinging my face and matting my dark brown hair against my forehead. I close my eyes for a moment, letting the water wash over my eyelids, focusing solely on the sensation of balance, the grip of my boots, the grounding weight of my tool belt. I wipe the water from my eyes with the back of my soaked wool sleeve and return to the mortise. I must reach a depth of exactly 8 inches to ensure the cantilevered support beam will hold the immense weight of the water that will eventually fill the pool. I strike the chisel again, the sound now muffled by the roar of the downpour. Talk, talk, talk. The water filling the mortise turns cloudy with suspended sawdust, a murky orange puddle that splashes back against my wrists with every strike. I use the chisel like a scoop, dragging the wet slush out of the hole, clearing the way for the next cut. After an hour of continuous grueling labor, the mortise is deep enough. I run my bare fingers along the inside walls of the cavity. The wood is cold, smooth where the steel has sheared the fibers cleanly, and slightly rough in the corners where I must now refine the shape. I pull a smaller 1-inch paring chisel from my leather pouch. I do not use the mallet for this. I place both hands on the handle, pressing my chest against the butt of the tool, using my body weight to push the blade through the final slivers of wood in the deepest corners of the joint. The sound is a soft, continuous tearing, like heavy canvas ripping slowly. The precision is paramount. If the joint is too loose, the beam will sag, the water will slope, and the immense pressure will eventually tear the pool apart, sending it crashing into the forest below. If it is too tight, the beam will not seat, and the friction will split the side of the mortise. I blow the remaining water and dust out of the hole, my breath creating a small spray of mist in the cold air. It is time to hoist the main support beam. The beam lies on a lower, wider branch, 20 feet below my current position. It is a massive, square timber of reclaimed Douglas fir, 6 inches by 8 inches thick, 12 feet long. It is incredibly heavy, made even denser by the rain it has absorbed over the past 2 days. I reach behind me and uncoil a long length of thick, braided hemp rope that is secured to a heavy forged iron ring embedded in my climbing harness. The rope is stiff, rough, and thoroughly soaked, smelling of tar and old earth. I toss the coiled end over a sturdy, thick branch directly above the mortise, creating a crude but effective natural pulley. The rough bark of the upper branch will provide immense friction, but I have chosen a spot where the bark has worn smooth over the years. I feed the rope down into the mist, watching it snake through the branches until it dangles just above the heavy timber. I carefully downclimb to the lower branch, my boots finding the familiar knots and burls in the wood. The descent is slow. The leather soles of my boots are saturated, the rubber grips slipping slightly on the green, waterlogged moss that coats the upper surfaces of the limbs. I rely on my hands, my fingers digging into the deep vertical grooves of the fir bark, finding holds that feel like stone. When I reach the lower branch, I kneel beside the massive timber. The wood is slick and cold. I slide the heavy hemp rope under the center of the beam, tying a specialized timber hitch, looping the rough fibers around the square edges, and pulling the knot incredibly tight. I wrap the bitter end around the standing line, twisting it back on itself so that the more tension is applied, the tighter the knot will bite into the wet wood. I stand up, taking the free end of the rope in my hands. I wrap the coarse, wet fibers around my forearms once, locking the line against my palms. I look up into the pouring rain, finding my footing on the thickest part of the branch, bending my knees and leaning back. I pull. The initial resistance is staggering. The friction of the wet rope over the branch above groans, a deep, protesting squeak that sounds like an animal in pain. The hemp fibers bite fiercely into the calluses on my palms, burning slightly despite the cold rain. The muscles in my back beneath the soaked wool shirt pull taut, burning with the sudden expenditure of energy. The beam shifts, sliding an inch across the rough bark of the branch, making a deep, scraping sound. I adjust my grip, breathe out a long, foggy plume of air, and pull again, driving backward with my legs. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy timber begins to rise. It clears the branch, swinging gently in the open air, a massive pendulum of wet, dark wood. The rain washes over it, making the rich grain gleam. I pull hand over hand, locking the rope behind my hip with every upward heave to prevent it from slipping back. The repetitive motion is a rhythmic agony. Reach, grip, pull, lock. Reach, grip, pull, lock. The sound of my heavy rhythmic breathing joins the percussive drumming of the rain. The sweat begins to mix with the rainwater on my face, running down my cheeks and into my short, rugged beard. I taste the salt on my lips. Upward, the beam travels, passing through the gray void, rising toward the carved mortise. When it is roughly level with the target branch, I quickly tie the rope off to a nearby stump of a broken limb, wrapping it in a figure-8 friction knot that holds the massive weight suspended in the air. My arms are shaking slightly from the exertion. I take a moment to rest, letting my hands hang at my sides, feeling the blood pump furiously through my forearms. The rain is a constant cooling relief on my overheated skin. I close my mouth, breathing deeply through my nose, lowering my heart rate, focusing on the calm, overwhelming presence of the forest, the smell of the wet pine needles, the vast, echoing space around me. I climb back up to the main branch, returning to the mortise. I uncoil a secondary thinner rope from my belt and throw it out, catching the end of the suspended timber. I pull the heavy beam toward me. It swings through the rain, resisting the change in direction, pulling back with its own immense inertia. I brace my boots against the tree trunk, leaning back, fighting the weight. The end of the beam comes within reach. I drop the thin rope and grab the thick, cold edges of the wood with both hands. It is incredibly heavy, pulling down against my grip, threatening to tear my fingers away. I guide the end of the beam toward the dark, rectangular mouth of the mortise. I have carved a corresponding tenon onto the end of this beam, a projecting piece of wood designed to fit perfectly into the hole. I line up the edges. The clearance is less than a fraction of an inch. I push. The wet wood slides into the cavity with a deep, resonating thump. It goes in 2 inches and stops, bound by the friction of the tight joint. I need to drive it home. I cannot use the heavy wooden mallet. It is too light to move the massive timber. Instead, I unclip a heavy, forged iron sledgehammer from the back of my tool belt. Its handle is short, thick hickory. I swing the sledgehammer sideways, striking the flat side of the beam near the joint. A deafening, metallic clang reverberates through the canopy, violently loud in the quiet rhythm of the rain. The shockwave rattles my teeth. The beam shudders and slides another inch into the mortise, accompanied by a high-pitched, tearing squeal of wet wood, forcefully rubbing against wet wood. I strike it again. Clang. And again. Clang. The physical effort of swinging the heavy iron in such a confined space, balancing on a slippery branch over a fatal drop, is immense. My core muscles lock in tight, rigid bands with every swing. The rain flies off the head of the sledgehammer in wide, violent arcs. The beam creeps deeper into the tree. Finally, with one last massive blow, the shoulder of the tenon sits flush against the bark of the main trunk. The sound of the final strike is different. A solid, deep, immovable thud. The joint is closed. It is perfect. But friction alone will not hold it against the elements and the weight of the water. It must be pegged. I holster the sledgehammer and draw a long, heavy auger bit and a wooden brace from my pack, which I have tied to a branch nearby. The brace is an antique, made of polished rosewood and brass, beautiful but heavily scarred by use. I fit the sharp spiral tip of the 1-inch auger bit against the side of the main trunk, aiming precisely so that the hole will pass through the trunk, only intersect the hidden tenon of the beam, and anchor it forever. I lean my chest against the rounded wooden pad at the back of the brace, pressing my body weight into the tool. My right hand grips the sweeping handle, and I begin to turn. The sound is an immediate, incredibly satisfying, low-pitched crunching. Kirk, Kirk, Kirk. The sharp steel thread at the tip of the auger pulls the bit deeper into the wet wood with every rotation. The wide, sharp-cutting lips slice through the fibers, sending long, continuous, curled ribbons of wet, pale wood spiraling out of the hole, falling over my hands and dropping into the abyss. The work is slow and requires constant, even pressure. I turn the crank round and round, a hypnotic circular motion. The muscles in my shoulder burn with a deep, dull ache. The rain washes over the brass fittings of the brace, keeping the steel cool as it grinds through the dense heartwood. I feel the exact moment the bit breaks through the bark of the trunk and enters the tenon of the beam inside the joint. The resistance changes, becoming slightly harder, the wood denser. I keep turning, grinding through the solid mass until the bit emerges cleanly on the other side of the trunk. I reverse the rotation, pulling the tool backward, dragging out a long, thick cylinder of packed, wet sawdust. I need a trunnel, a tree nail to lock the joint. I reach into my canvas side pocket and retrieve a length of dry, straight-grained white oak that I split this morning before the rain began. I sit down on the thickest part of the branch, letting my legs dangle over the side. I pull a small, razor-sharp carving knife from a leather sheath on my chest. I hold the square oak peg in my left hand and begin to whittle it down to a perfect cylinder. The sound of the knife moving through the dry oak is a sharp, clean shh. Thin, pale shavings curl away from the blade, catching the wind and fluttering down like snow before the rain knocks them out of the sky. I work entirely by feel and eye, rotating the peg, slicing away the corners, tapering the leading edge so it will drive easily into the hole, and leaving the back end slightly thicker so it will wedge itself immovably tight. The smell of the dry oak is different from the wet cedar. It is sharp, slightly acidic, and smells like old whiskey barrels. I finish the peg, sliding my thumb over the smooth, faceted surface to check for any high spots. I stand up, walk back to the joint, and insert the tapered end of the oak peg into the freshly bored hole. It slides in easily for the first few inches, then stops. I draw my heavy wooden mallet. I strike the end of the peg. Tok. It moves a quarter inch. The pitch of the impact is high, ringing. I strike it harder. Titwek. The pitch drops slightly as the oak peg compresses, wedging itself tighter into the surrounding wet cedar. I fall into a steady rhythm. Thwek, thwek, thwek. With every blow, the sound deepens, becoming a heavy, deadened thud. The oak is being crushed into the microscopic pores of the surrounding wood, creating a mechanical lock that will only grow stronger as the wet cedar eventually dries and shrinks around the dry oak, gripping it like a vice. The peg is driven flush with the bark. The joint is now indestructible. This single cantilevered beam, jutting out over nothingness, is the first side of the frame that will support the pool. I must repeat this exact process 3 more times to create the massive square perimeter. The hours bleed into one another, measured only by the repetitive, grueling physical tasks and the shifting intensity of the storm. The sky above the canopy deepens into a bruised, dark gray, filtering the light into a cold, heavy twilight, even though it is only midday. The rain never stops. It morphs from a driving downpour into a fine, heavy mist that coats everything in a slippery sheen, and then back into heavy, fat drops that explode against the wood. My hands are numb with cold, the skin pruned and stained black from the tannins in the wood and the wet leather of my tools. My breathing is a constant rhythmic rasp in the quiet air. I hoist, I saw, I chisel, I bore, I hammer. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the frame emerges. 4 massive beams, interlocking at the corners with complex dovetail joints that I cut suspended in the air, creating a solid square platform measuring 10 feet by 10 feet, bridging the gap between 2 colossal limbs of the mother tree. The structure is raw, brutal, and beautiful, the wet wood shining darkly against the backdrop of the fog. Now comes the floor. The basin must hold thousands of gallons of water. It must be watertight, immensely strong, and perfectly level. I have pre-milled dozens of thick tongue-and-groove planks of old-growth hard pine for this purpose. The pine is dense, heavy with natural resin, which will help resist rot and repel water. I haul the planks up in bundles of 3, the hemp rope groaning under the weight, my back screaming with the repetitive strain. I lay the first plank across the frame, nearest to the main trunk. I use my heavy framing square to ensure it is perfectly perpendicular to the support beams. I secure it using long, forged iron nails. I pull a handful of the heavy, square-cut nails from my canvas pouch. They are cold, coated in a thin layer of oil that smells sharp and metallic. I set the first nail into the pine, holding it between my numb thumb and forefinger. I strike it with my steel framing hammer. The sound is sharp, an incredibly loud, ringing tink that shatters the damp silence. I strike again. Tang, tang, tang. The hammer blows are fast, accurate, driving the heavy iron deep into the dense pine and down into the cedar beam below. The head of the nail sinks, flush with the wet wood, crushing the fibers slightly, creating a small, water-pooling depression. I drive 4 nails into the first plank, locking it down. I fetch the second plank. This one has a deep groove carved along its edge, designed to swallow the projecting tongue of the first plank. I lay it down, sliding the groove over the tongue. It binds halfway. The wood has swollen slightly in the relentless damp. I cannot force it with my hands. I take a scrap block of wood, place it against the outer edge of the loose plank, and strike the block heavily with my wooden mallet. Whack, whack, whack. The heavy impacts force the plank inward. The sound of the wet wood sliding together is a tight, high-pitched squeal, a friction-heavy groan of tight tolerances. The joint closes completely, a seamless, hairline fracture between the 2 thick boards. The rain instantly fills the microscopic gap, pooling on the flat surface of the new floor. I secure the second plank with the iron nails. Ting, tang, ang. And so, the floor progresses. Haul, place, align, beat into place, nail down. The platform grows, pushing out over the empty space, a solid raft in a sea of gray mist and green needles. As I lay the planks, my body moves out onto the newly built floor, testing the strength of my own engineering. The platform feels incredibly solid beneath my boots, a rigid, immovable surface high in the swaying canopy. But it is dangerously slick. The rainwater sits on the fresh hard pine, turning the flat surface into a frictionless slide. I have to move slowly, keeping my center of gravity low, my boots sliding carefully, rather than lifting and stepping, shuffling across the wet wood. The rain continues its endless drumming, hitting the flat wooden floor with a sound completely different from its impact on the leaves or my shoulders. It is a sharp, chaotic pattern. 1,000 tiny drum beats dancing across the timber. I listen to the sound, losing myself in the white noise, letting the repetitive physical labor empty my mind.
God, these are
There is only the
heavy.
rain, the wood, the cold,
Just a
and the
few more
next
to go.
nail. By the time I reach the far edge of the floor, the light is beginning to fail in earnest. The deep shadows of the forest floor are rising, swallowing the trunks of the trees below, creeping up toward my suspended sanctuary. I must build the walls of the basin before I lose the light completely. The walls will be constructed of thick 6 by 6 inch square timbers, stacked horizontally like a log cabin, interlocked at the corners with tight, waterproof lap joints. I haul the first wall timber up. It is heavier than the floor planks, a massive, dense block of wood. I lay it along the outer edge of the floor, aligning it perfectly with the perimeter frame below. To secure the walls, I will not use nails. They would pull out under the outward pressure of the water. I will use long, threaded iron rods that pass entirely through the stacked timbers and anchor deep into the foundational beams. I grab the heavy auger brace again. I center the bit on top of the wall timbers and begin to bore down. The angle is awkward. I am kneeling on the slick, wet floor, leaning over the edge, staring down into the dizzying drop. The rain runs off the brim of my forehead, dripping directly onto my hands as I turn the crank. The hole must go completely through the 6-inch timber, through the floor plank, and deep into the underlying beam. It takes an exhausting amount of time and pressure. When the bit finally hits the hollow cavity of the joint, I pull it back out, clearing the wet shavings. I take a long, heavy iron rod, threaded at both ends. I drop it into the hole. It slides down with a metallic shh sound, hitting the bottom with a dull click. I thread a heavy square iron washer and a thick nut onto the top of the rod. I take a large heavy iron wrench from my belt. I fit the jaws over the square nut and pull. The wrench is cold and wet, slipping slightly in my hand. I wipe my palm on my damp canvas pants, re-grip the steel, and lean back. The nut turns. The metal groans, a harsh grating screech of iron against iron. I pull harder, tightening the rod, drawing the massive wall timber down with hundreds of pounds of compressive force. The wood creaks loudly, a sharp, popping sound as the wet fibers are crushed tightly against the floor planks, forming a watertight seal. I begin the second layer of the wall. This is where the technical challenge of the suspended environment suddenly magnifies the danger. The wind, which had died down to a low moan, suddenly shifts, roaring back through the canopy with a violent, chaotic energy. The colossal Douglas fir groans, a deep, terrifying vibration that shakes the entire platform. The tree sways, leaning heavily to the left. The floor tilts beneath me. I drop to my hands and knees, pressing my palms flat against the slick, wet pine, feeling the world tilt on its axis. The rain whips sideways, stinging my face like thrown gravel. I am holding the rope attached to the heaviest corner beam, trying to haul it up from the lower branch. As the tree sways, the pendulum motion of the suspended timber becomes wild, uncontrollable. The beam swings far out into the void, pulling the heavy hemp rope violently through my hands. The friction is instantaneous and severe. The coarse fibers burn across my calloused palms, searing through the thick skin. I grit my teeth, a sharp hiss escaping my lips, but I do not let go. If I lose the rope, the beam will plummet to the forest floor, destroying days of preparation. I brace my boots against the slightly raised edge of the first wall timber, locking my knees, leaning my entire body weight backward against the pull of the rope. The beam reaches the apex of its swing and comes hurtling back toward the structure. It is a 400-pound battering ram made of wet cedar, flying blindly through the storm. I have to catch it, or it will smash into the newly laid floor, splintering the pine and potentially knocking me off the edge. I drop the standing end of the rope, relying entirely on the friction knot I quickly threw around the upper branch, and lunge forward toward the edge of the platform. I wrap both arms around the wet, flying timber, just as it crests the edge of the floor. The impact is brutal. The heavy, wet wood slams into my chest and shoulder, knocking the breath from my lungs in a sharp, explosive gasp. The momentum drags me forward. My boots slip on the slick pine floor. I am sliding toward the edge, my arms wrapped desperately around the beam, my face pressed against the rough, wet bark. I stare down over the edge of the timber into the swirling gray mist. There is nothing below me but empty air and the distant, unseen ground. Adrenaline floods my system, a hot metallic rush that sharpens the edges of the world. I tighten my grip, my fingers digging into the corners of the wood, the muscles in my forearms cramping with the desperate exertion. I kick my right leg out, blindly searching for purchase. The heel of my leather boot catches the head of one of the iron nails I drove into the floor. It is only a fraction of an inch, but it is enough. I stop sliding. I am hanging halfway over the edge of the suspended pool, the heavy timber resting on my chest, the rain pouring down my back. I hang there for a long moment, breathing heavily, the air rasping in my throat, listening to the violent rush of my own pulse pounding in my ears. The wind howls around me, tearing at my wet clothing. Slowly, agonizingly, I begin to pull myself backward. I use my core strength, inching my body and the heavy timber back onto the center of the platform. The wet wood scrapes harshly against the pine floor. When I'm safely away from the edge, I roll the beam off my chest and lie flat on the floor, staring up into the dark, swirling canopy above. The rain hits my face, cold and shocking, washing away the sweat and the fear. I close my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, feeling the solid, immovable strength of the floor beneath my back. The tree continues to sway gently, a slow, oceanic roll, but the violence of the gust has passed. I force myself to sit up. The work is not done. I examine my hands. The rope has burned a red raw streak across both palms, the skin peeled back slightly, mixing with the dark tannin stains. I wipe them on my canvas pants, wincing slightly at the stinging friction, and return to the beam. I heave it onto the wall, aligning the complex lap joints at the corners. I take my heavy framing hammer and pound the joint together. The sound is furious, heavy, echoing my adrenaline. Whack, whack, whack. I bore the holes, drop the iron rods, and tighten the nuts until the metal screams and the wood compresses into a solid, unbroken wall. I work with a frantic, focused energy, racing against the dying light and the biting cold. Layer by layer, the basin rises. It is 2 feet deep, massive, heavy, and beautiful. The interior is a smooth, continuous square of yellow heart pine and dark cedar, gleaming wet in the twilight. The structure is built, but it is not a pool. It is merely a wooden box. To hold water permanently, it must be completely sealed. I open a large canvas duffel bag that I hauled up earlier in the day. Inside is a heavy waterproof tin containing the sealant. I could not use modern chemicals or silicone. They would poison the water and look unnatural in this ancient place. Instead, I spent weeks harvesting pine pitch from the damaged bark of the giant trees, melting it down over a slow fire, and mixing it with fine, powdery wood ash from my campfires, and rich, heavy blue clay dug from the riverbank miles below. The resulting mixture is a thick, incredibly sticky black paste that smells strongly of turpentine, wood smoke, and wet earth. I plunge my bare hands into the cold tin. The paste is stiff, resisting my fingers like thick dough. I scoop out a large, heavy handful. It sticks to my skin, a cold, tar-like substance. I kneel in the corner of the basin. The rain is falling lightly now, a steady, quiet drizzle that barely makes a sound as it hits the wood. The forest is settling into the deep, breathless quiet of the coming night. I press the black paste into the seam where the floor meets the wall. I use my thumb and the heel of my palm to force the thick mixture deep into the microscopic cracks between the timbers. The sound of spreading the pitch is a thick, wet, scraping noise. A slow, sticky schluck, schluck that echoes softly inside the hollow walls of the pool. The texture is gritty from the clay and ash, scraping slightly against the smooth wood. I run my fingers along the seam, smoothing the paste into a neat, concave fillet, completely sealing the joint. I move slowly around the perimeter of the pool, working completely by touch in the near darkness. My hands are coated in a thick, waterproof layer of black tar. The repetitive motion of pressing and smoothing the paste becomes a deeply meditative act. The physical danger is past. The heavy lifting is done. There is only the careful, meticulous sealing of every corner, every seam, every nail head. The smell of pine pitch is overwhelming, sharp and medicinal, clearing my sinuses and mixing with the heavy scent of petrichor rising from the forest floor. I seal the lap joints in the walls, forcing the paste into the interlocking grain of the wood, ensuring that not a single drop of water will escape. When the entire interior is sealed, my hands are numb, stained completely black, aching with a deep, satisfying fatigue. The structure is complete. It is a pool suspended in the sky, a watertight basin clinging to the side of a giant, waiting to be filled. But I do not have a hose, and I cannot haul thousands of gallons of water up 80 feet of rope. I must rely on the storm that has been soaking me all day. I climb back up to the upper branches, my boots slipping slightly on the slick wood. I move carefully, feeling the immense drop hidden in the darkness below. I prepared a catchment system, a massive, hollowed-out log of dead cedar, split in half to create a long, wide trough. I positioned the trough carefully, resting one end on a higher branch and tying it securely with rope, aiming the other end directly out over the center of the newly built pool. Above the upper end of the trough, a massive cluster of thick fir branches forms a natural funnel, collecting the rain that falls on the upper canopy and channeling it down the trunk. I take my hatchet and carefully chip away at the bark of the main trunk, creating a shallow, diagonal groove that acts as a gutter, diverting the streaming rainwater away from the trunk and directly into the hollowed log. Almost immediately, the water begins to flow. It runs down the carved groove in the bark, gathering volume, a small, dark stream of incredibly cold, pure rainwater. It spills off the lip of the bark and splashes into the wooden trough. The sound is a sudden, sharp, musical splashing, a bright, chaotic noise that cuts through the quiet drizzle of the night. The water runs down the length of the trough, a rushing, liquid whisper, racing toward the edge. I sit on the branch, watching the dark water flowing past my boots, mesmerizing in its constant motion. It reaches the end of the hollow log and arcs out into the empty air, falling 10 feet in a continuous, heavy stream, and crashes into the center of the wooden basin below. Sploosh, sploosh, splatter. The sound of the heavy stream of water hitting the flat, hollow floor of the pool is incredibly loud, deep, and resonant. It sounds like a drum, hollow and ringing, echoing out into the vast, dark forest. I climb slowly back down to the edge of the pool. I sit on the thick wooden wall, leaning my back against the rough bark of the main trunk and watch the water. The process is slow. The basin is large, and the stream, though steady, will take hours to fill it. I sit there in the dark, the cold rain still falling lightly on my face, my wet clothes clinging to my exhausted body, and I listen to the sounds. The heavy, continuous splash of the waterfall hitting the center of the pool. The slow, creeping sound of the water spreading across the dry pine floor. A quiet, hissing whisper as it covers the wood. The occasional, sharp crack of a dead branch falling somewhere deep in the forest. The deep, rumbling groan of the ancient tree shifting its immense weight in the wind. The sounds blend together, a natural symphony of water and wood, chaotic and yet deeply soothing, a rhythmic white noise that washes away the exhaustion of the day. As the water level rises, the sound changes. The hollow drumming deepens, becoming a heavier, richer tone as the water absorbs the impact. I dip my hand into the pool. The water is freezing, shocking my skin, washing some of the sticky black pitch from my fingers. It is crystal clear, pure rainwater, tinted slightly yellow by the fresh pine floor. I can feel the immense pressure beginning to build inside the basin. The wooden walls groan softly, a low, continuous creaking as the timbers take the weight of the water, pressing tightly against the threaded iron rods. The structure holds. It does not leak. It is a solid, immovable fortress of wood and iron, cradling the captured storm. Hours pass. I do not sleep. I remain sitting on the edge of the pool, falling into a light, trance-like state, mesmerized by the sound of the falling water and the shifting darkness of the forest. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the absolute blackness of the night begins to lift. The sky above the canopy turns a deep, bruised purple, then a cold slate and gray. The rain, which has fallen constantly for the past 24 hours, finally begins to ease. The heavy drops turn into a fine, floating mist, and then, miraculously, the mist begins to thin. The light of dawn breaks through the towering trunks of the forest, weak and diffused, but incredibly beautiful. It is a pale, silver light that illuminates the billions of water droplets clinging to the pine needles, turning the entire canopy into a glittering, jeweled ceiling. The wind dies completely, leaving a profound, unbroken silence, save for the quiet trickling sound of the water still flowing from the catchment trough. I stand up, my joints stiff and aching from the cold and the long hours of stillness. I stretch my back, feeling the muscles pop and grind. I look down into the pool. It is full. The water level is exactly 2 inches below the top of the wooden walls. The surface is perfectly still, a dark, flawless mirror that reflects the towering branches and the silver sky above. The wood of the basin has darkened significantly, saturated with the water, looking ancient and permanent, as if it grew naturally from the side of the tree. The structure is a complete success. The mortise joints hold firm. The iron rods are locked. The pitch seal is absolute. I unbuckle the heavy leather tool belt from my waist. The thick hide drops to the wooden floor with a heavy metallic clatter, the chisels, saws, and hammers chiming against one another. I unbutton the soaked, heavy wool shirt, peeling the cold, wet fabric from my chest and shoulders. I drop it onto the wall. I step out of the heavy canvas work pants, leaving them in a wet pile on the wood. I stand on the edge of the pool in the freezing morning air, feeling the bite of the cold on my bare skin, shivering slightly, looking out over the dizzying drop into the forest below. The ground is invisible, hidden beneath a thick blanket of white morning fog. I am floating on a small wooden raft above the clouds. I take a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean scent of the rain-washed forest,
The pressure's
and step forward into the
holding,
water.
but the
shock
resin, it's
is
leaching
absolute.
fast.
The water is ice cold,
Just one
driving the
drop.
breath from my lungs in a sharp
Check the
gasp.
iron.
I lower
This
my
can't
body slowly,
fail.
feeling the water rise up my legs, my waist, my chest. The cold is a physical pressure, squeezing my muscles, burning my skin for a brief, intense moment before an overwhelming wave of
Firm
numbness
and
and deep,
sealed.
soothing relief washes over
Looks
me.
good.
I sink down until the water is up to my chin. I rest my arms on the thick wooden rim of the basin, resting my chin on my hands, staring out into the misty canopy. The water holds me, suspending me in the sky. The aches and pains of the brutal labor dissolve into the freezing clarity of the rain. The silence of the forest is absolute, perfect, heavy with the weight of the ancient trees. I am completely still, a part of the water, a part of the wood, a part of the massive, breathing tree holding me high above the earth. I close my eyes, listening to the final, slow, dripping sounds of the passing storm falling from the leaves, hitting the mirrored surface of the pool with a soft, delicate, ringing clink, clink, clink. I drift in the cold, clear water, suspended between the earth and the sky, enveloped in the quiet, overwhelming peace of the sanctuary I have built with my own two hands.